Hey guys, welcome to the studio. Irene. She's an itty bitty bird with a big ass forehead. Anyway, one of my friends on Discord reached out to me to commission for making some of Irene's props. Now, this bitch got 3 props. She's got her rapier, her lantern, and her hand cannon or gun or whatever. Now, my friend didn't really care about getting like a super accurate model of the hand cannon. He pretty much just figured you could get something else online, but I prefer accuracy. And if I was going to make the props of a character, and I'm gonna make all of them or make them for myself in the future, I would prefer accuracy above all else. But at the time, I didn't really have the skills to 3D model Irene's props, so I commissioned someone else to 3D model them. Specifically, I reached out to Cha on Fiverr for some 3D modeling work. She did a really great job. I highly recommend her. 3D modeling is fairly difficult. There's some caveats with the 3D model itself, but it serves fairly well for prop making. Anyway, let's get right into it. So the first 3D model we're going to look at is the lantern. Now, for those who are familiar with Mesh Mixer, you're going to be able to tell that the glass of the lantern has like, I don't even know what you call it. It's like a zero density mesh or something where it's not like a solid body. It's able to export just fine as an STL, but I'll be able to show you some of the issues and the workarounds involving that. Aside from that, everything else is fairly straightforward. A lot of small, delicate pieces that I would highly recommend printing with a resin printer, just because as you 3D print some of these pieces, especially this bottom section of the lantern, unless your retraction settings are really dialed in, your 3D printer is going to have a fairly hard time printing all these delicate pieces at once. Not without like either some part snapping, some part just under extruding, and then one of the pieces being very flimsy. This loop is fairly straightforward, I would say. You're just going to really need to lower your support angle in order to add more supports. That way, as your 3D printer climbs up and up and up, printing higher, it doesn't get so flimsy that each movement of the nozzle jostles it and moves it around. That way, it can be printed without any ringing or flaws. Some of the other parts may need to be printed in one chunk, but it's kind of an experimental thing because I didn't really print it and assemble it all at once. I pretty much just got a little too busy. So let me know if there's any issues with any of the pieces down in the comment section. But yeah, moving on to the glass. So whenever you load up the glass section on your slicer software, it's going to look pretty nice. It's going to look thin with a open top and open bottom. But the moment you slice it, you look at the runtime and the amount of grams, and then you look at the preview, and you're going to see that it is solid, completely solid. This has happened before with like zero density meshes or whatever you want to call it. There is a trick to printing it. You're going to want to go into your infill, turn your infill to 0, that way you're printing in vase mode pretty much, and then you're going to want to go into your top and bottom. Turn your top and bottom layers to 0 for both. The walls, I would recommend setting the wall line count to maybe 2 or 3. This is assuming you are printing with clear filament. But anyway, after you slice, you're going to see that the amount of material and runtime is going to be much less. We're going to go ahead and preview, and now we can see that it is printing all the way through, just like a vase. You're going to get some stringing in between, depending on what brand of filament you're using and how dialed in your retraction settings are. Another thing to note is that with the very low surface contact of the lantern glass piece, you're going to want to really up your brim width. That way it'll have much more contact with your bed and you'll have better bed adhesion. You may want to go a little slow as it reaches up higher, but other than that, you should be good. Moving back to the rest of the 3D model of the lantern, some pieces such as the handles or the side bars or whatever, they're fitted in there it's not perfect the way it cuts into it. I will upload a full model, that way you can slice it however you want and attach things however you want. But as I was printing it, where the mesh overlaps allow it to fuse together, I noticed that the way they were slotted in, they kind of just fell apart, where it would very easily fall out of where it would intersect. So after you print it, I would highly recommend just adding some super glue right into those little crevices. That way it will stay in place. And as for the handle, fuck if I know. I haven't printed that shit. It doesn't look too difficult. Just, you know, just make it like maximum infill. Make sure it's really sturdy. I don't know. Just go for it, dude. Okay, with the lantern out of the way, we're going to move on to the rapier. So the rapier is fairly straightforward compared to the lantern. The lantern, it's going to have a lot of delicate pieces that will almost require resin 3D printing. You can get away with some filament 3D printing, but yeah. With the rapier, there's certain things about it that will require some finagling, especially if you're going to custom slice it yourself. For example, if you separate out the shells, there are a lot of really tiny pieces that are left in there, as well as a central zero density mesh or whatever that I believe the 3D modeler used as like a guide for modeling the general shape of the rapier and was left in there. You kind of have to remove that. Now, I already did remove that as I was slicing it apart, and from the links that I sent to you guys, they'll have these sliced apart pieces that are pretty much ready to 3D print on your standard 220 by 220 3D print bed. Now, things to keep in mind for Irene's rapier. This piece right here, the very end of her rapier, the pommel part slash part of the handle, I would highly recommend printing it a much higher infill than you may be used to. Maybe 50% or even higher. This is primarily because of these little side pieces right here. They're very delicate, especially if printed in this orientation. And honestly, these parts are probably going to be the part that will snap off if you don't print it in a higher density. In addition, I would up the line count by +1 to whatever you are used to. I would just go with 4, and that should do you fairly well. As for support, I typically go with 60%. As you can see here, that's not going to be enough. That's this amount of support making contact with this very delicate piece right here is just, it's not going to print very well. And when you're going to have the support make contact at this height, it's going to fail, and all this 3D print material is going to be wasted. I would highly recommend lowering your support overhang angle to around 30%. As you can see, this creates a whole lot of supports. Maybe a lot more than you're comfortable with using as far as using material goes, but better to print once than fail. And if you really feel like it, I would highly recommend making use of support blockers. You'll just have to place it where you feel most comfortable as far as where your 3D printer is capable of printing. The most important part is to make sure that you have plenty of surface contact with your support and these very delicate pieces here. Okay, so for blade piece 4, very similar to the pommel piece, there are certain parts that you're going to need to really dial in your supports. Specifically, these little end pieces right here on either side of the sword hilt. Basic problem is very small surface area as far as support overhang goes. If I had my support overhang at 60%, it would send like one line up to make contact here, and the rest of the printing will just not go very well. So right here, I have my support set to 30%. I'm gonna go ahead and up that to 40% roughly. And as you can see, we got a whole ass load of support. Now, once again, you can go ahead and use some support blockers in order to save a bit of material, but this is a very complex piece with a lot of overlapping chunks, and I would just recommend printing this as is. Print it relatively slowly just so that it doesn't fail. Now, one thing to note, and this is very, very important, the parts where these little fucking loop motherfuckers make contact with this ring piece right here, it is pretty much just overlapping. So I would highly recommend the moment you finish printing this, just apply some super glue to these contact points. That way you won't have to like mess around with them as much. They'll be able to stay in place. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I would recommend printing with a wall line count of 4 at the minimum. And you don't have to go as crazy with the infill density. Probably wall line count of 4 and 8% at cubic subdivision will be fine. You can up the density if you want, especially since it's the handle. As for the rest of the blade pieces, just print them with a wall line count of 4 or 5 and they should be good. All right, moving on to the handgun. Handgun is easy as fuck. It is a very simple piece, and even if I separate out the shells, there's a lot of little chunks, but they're pretty much just going to be printed together anyway. Now I will include the full 3D model as well as the slices that I personally did. I pretty much just sliced this bad boy in half with the left and right side of the handgun and the cylinder being a completely separate piece. That way you can just slide it in and out or glue it in there. Anyway, that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and ask me in the comment section. If there are any problems with the 3D models that you download ahead of time, just let me know. Reach out to me either on YouTube or through Cults 3D, and then I'll go ahead and take a look at them. They should mostly be good. I'm not the one who 3D modeled them. This sort of 3D modeling through Blender that I believe the modeler that the designer used. I suck at Blender, so I can give some advice as far as printing them and assembly goes, but modifying these particular 3D models, like, I'm not that great with it. I don't mess with Blender. So yeah, just let me know if you guys have any questions, any comments, concerns, any requests out there. If you want to reach out to me for commissions, let me know. If you like this content, go ahead and like, subscribe, whatever the fuck. All right, see you guys later.